Indigo Park is a game that needs no introduction, mostly because that's not the game I'm talking about today. But if you think I'm above name-dropping an extremely trendy horror title in a desperate bid for more views, then you clearly think too highly of me. No, The Park is a horror game that does not star an oddly well-animated persona named Rambly, but a middle-aged white woman who has significantly less fan art. But, much like Indigo Park, The Park takes place in a run-down theme park that has something sinister going on under the hood. Considering there's a lost child in the mix, if you've ever played a horror game or even have a basic grasp of the idea of horror, most of your guesses as to the plot are probably correct. On this channel, I want to make videos about games I have some kind of passion for. I absolutely love My Friendly Neighborhood, but my passion for the park is somewhat different. You see, the biggest difference between My Friendly Neighborhood and the park is that the park is, well, it's just bad. But bad in a way that makes me absolutely fascinated. It's not the train wreck kind of bad that is Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach, or even a so bad it's good deal like Garden of... Well, no, that one's just plain bad. Rather, this game is like the developers read a book titled What Not to Do when making a horror game, but missed the part that said not, resulting in a game that does almost absolutely everything wrong. I'm serious, there are a total of 2 good decisions in this game that I will cover when we get to them, but this is less a game to me and more of a case study on how not to make a horror game. I hope you learned something from this experience, because all I learned was a very quick and disappointing way to waste $15. Then again, maybe that's a lesson I need, since I also bought Balan Wonderworld. If that disclaimer hasn't put you in the mood to laugh, then the game's actual disclaimer will, since it straight up claims that the park will manipulate our graphics, audio, and our sanity, and to not seek psychiatric help afterwards. By the way, I'm pretty certain this entire statement is a lie because A, I never noticed any change in my graphics or control settings, and B, I'm making an entire YouTube essay overanalyzing a game I think is utter garbage, so I probably should be seeking help after this. Anyway, we start playing the game as Lorraine, who was a wonderful mother and has never done anything wrong, and her creepy son Callum, who is absolutely still alive. We're here after hours looking for his teddy bear when he runs into the park ahead of us. The security officer here explicitly sees that happen. Remember that. Normally you'd assume a security guard would help us track down our son, but he went to the Fazbear School of Security Guarding and thus can't move from that spot. Thus, it's up to us to find our son. The game arms us with a dedicated Callum button.
Wait for mommy, Callum!
And we're on our way. For about 10 seconds before we're forced to stop and listen to Lorraine monologue for a moment.
There's something special about the entrance to an amusement park. A line drawn between the real world and the world of whimsy within. It's no wonder Callum ran back inside. I wouldn't want to leave either.
After that monologue, we then learn that this park was built by Elon Musk because everything around us rusts up like a Cybertruck in a light drizzle. This is where we get our first cardinal sin of the game. It's establishing shot. Establishing shots in a horror game are absolutely paramount to establishing mood. They can either happen right away, like the spooky corridor in Amnesia Dark Descent, or after leaving normalcy, like the dark, unfamiliar room in Soma. Unfortunately, this establishing shot does not convey the same sense of dread or unease. For one, this setting is just a slightly dirty road. We're not even anywhere isolated. There's a security guard and our car just behind us. But more importantly, this shot fails to be scary on an evolutionary level. Yes, I am going to be talking about goddamn evolution as I dissect this game. That is how morbidly fascinated I am. To clarify, all humans harbor some level of both claustrophobia and agoraphobia. That's not to say we're all scared of small and open spaces, but rather it is easier for us to become fearful in those places. This is because, during the Paleolithic era, the best way to avoid getting eaten by lions was to run for cover and just wait for them to leave. That's right, turns out early humans were all Maymanes, which explains why the human race is so prone to cancer. See, for our weight class, humans are pretty slow and pretty weak, so if we were spotted in a wide open area, we'd be run down and killed, lending us our agoraphobic nature, and if we were in a tight space with poor visibility, we'd be ambushed and killed, lending us our claustrophobic nature. We've seen both used in games to create tension, such as the open depths of Subnautica or the cramped halls of pretty much any horror game you can think of. The park, however, is almost always set in places like this, areas with good lines of sight but also ample cover. Whether you realize it or not, your brain is already subconsciously making observations of the safest possible spots to hide if something shows up. We're even immediately provided with a map of the entire park, removing another layer of uncertainty and fear we could have been left with. It's fine to give a player a general sense of direction in a horror game, but giving the player a map immediately at the start of the game is removing too much of the mystery. You may be calling me out for My Friendly Neighborhood's use of maps, but that game waits until you've already explored a good chunk of each area before giving it to you. Even Five Nights at Freddy's Security Breach waited to give you a map, but in that case the map was so bad it actually confused the player more than it helped. Maybe Security Breach was actually genius all along. Anyway, we chase Callum past an actually pretty sick-looking haunted house. Legitimately, I could see a lot of little kids being afraid of this case, though this makes me wonder why park management decided to put this right at the entrance. Unfortunately, Callum decides this just isn't interesting enough for him and keeps running down the empty path with nothing on it. In fact, most of the game is this, empty paths with nothing on them, which doesn't exactly scream theme park to me, and trust me, I'm an expert on theme park layout. I've been playing Roller Coaster Tycoon since I was 8. Farther along the path we find a shoe, but more importantly, we come to one of the only 2 things I think this game does right. Chad the Chipmunk. Despite Lorraine dismissing him as a
drunk guy in a suit,
his build-up is extremely well done. You might be saying, wait, you're not supposed to show the monster yet, and in most cases, you're correct. However, Chad here is using something I call horror of the mundane. This is where you take a real-world object or concept, introduce it as mundane, and then twist it to make it supernatural or horrific, thus turning the familiar unfamiliar. If this sounds familiar, that's because this concept has largely been hijacked by the mascot horror genre. Unfortunately, it's almost never done correctly. Too often the mascots are strange from the get-go, with rows of teeth or uncanny stares. Take the smiling critters, for example. These would never be successfully sold as actual children's toys as they are far too creepy, but they also aren't grotesque or horrific enough to serve as threatening monsters. In fact, the only truly scary thing about these smiling critters is how active their shipping community is. And I'm not talking FedEx, buddy, I'm talking fanfics and art as far as the eye can see. But horror of the mundane can make for some truly unsettling and creeping horror, and one of the best examples is Five Nights at Freddy's, specifically the animatronics from the first game, not the ones with even more fan art than Rambley and the smiling critters. Okay, how about a rule of thumb? A horror monster is badly designed if people want to bang. Never mind, I just remember the Alien Queen. Why she got that cake though? The animatronics in the first game look like animatronics you could realistically see in a Chuck E. Cheese. In fact, the very first shot of the trio are when they're on stage, not moving like you would expect a shutdown animatronic to do. That's why when these completely normal looking animatronics do move and start doing things that real life animatronics shouldn't, it's so much more unnerving, and that's what Chad is doing here. We even find notes later about how people know the guy wearing the Chad suit and how he's slowly acting stranger, never taking it off, starting to smell weird, and suddenly knowing how to make ice sculptures. It culminates in an incident where Chad, while working on another sculpture, gets insulted by a park goer and then goes ballistic and stabs the guy's eye out with an ice pick. It's honestly a weird and unnerving build-up, and it's expertly done. Too bad there's no payoff. Yeah, I'm just gonna spoil this now. Chad is basically never used. He shows up 2 times for canned jump scares that are more like stand scares, since he just stands there. So despite all this incredible build-up, all this effort to make Chad creepy and weird, his actual threat to the player is about the same as the threat of my videos making any kind of an impact to my bank account. Please like and subscribe. Leaving that disappointment behind, we remember our other disappointment and continue chasing after our son. He's boarded one of the swan boats, and instead of Lorraine being a rational human being and just waiting for him to come back around, she decides she's going to chase him down on these completely automated boats that go all the same speed. If you want to argue that she thinks they're pedal boats, Lorraine herself states that she and Callum have been to this park dozens of times before, so really, I think she just wants an excuse to get on the ride for free. I can't say I understand, because this is without exaggeration the most boring carnival ride since your mom. For one, this boat ride moves at the pace of a Walmart shopper, which explains why the swan itself is so white. Second, this ride has absolutely zero scenery. The only entertainment we get is a retelling of the story of Hansel and Gretel as told by a narrator who sounds like he was paid with a grilled cheese sandwich, but he was kinda hungry that day, so he at least put a little effort into it. And I know I use a lot of hyperbole, but please understand that I am not joking at all when I say that the retelling of Hansel and Gretel takes almost 8 real-life minutes. There is no joke. This game forces you onto this boat where you cannot move or interact with anything for exactly 7 minutes and 34 seconds. Every now and then you'll get a little bump or distorted sound effect, and at the end the swan boat does this. But for 7.5 minutes, you are forced to sit through the most boring sequence I have ever experienced in any game whatsoever, and I've engaged in the combat in Xenoblade Chronicles 2. Clearly then, the devs really think the story of Hansel and Gretel is absolutely required knowledge to enjoy this game. In fact, Lorraine even monologues about Hansel and Gretel just after, so I'm going to try a little experiment. Starting now, I'm going to cut out all explicit mentions of Hansel and Gretel. I want you, yes you, the one watching this video right now eating your dinner, to see if you can pick up on exactly why Hansel and Gretel is so important to this story. So important that the game took 7.5 minutes to forcibly tell us this story. For reference, I had to spend about $15, including tax, to buy this game, and it took me about 90 minutes to beat, so this boat ride cost me about the price of a McDouble, which would have been a far more interesting and engaging experience than this. Shockingly, getting in the boat did not allow us to catch up to Callum, so instead we continue down the forest path and find a crashed van, inside of which is a teddy bear bleeding from a stab to the eye. This is never explained and honestly feels like a cheap set piece, but we also get a bit of lore. This is actually the second lore document we find, but the first was so token and generic you could probably already guess what it says. In short, the park owner, Nathaniel Winter, bought this island from a man literally called Old Man Henderson, who was doing some generic occult shenanigans which Winter wants to tap into. There are a few select people who may recognize all the names I've mentioned so far, and this is where I need to address the origins of this game. Technically, the park is a spin-off of The Secret World, both developed by Funcom. If you don't know The Secret World, it's that one MMO that was based off of the Illuminati, vampires, demons, and other supernatural forces set in modern times. Atlantic Island Park itself is actually a sub-area in that MMO. I only briefly played that game, definitely not enough to reach this tie-in, but because of this relation, there are several notes I came across with names or references that are only brought up once, which I can only assume are references to The Secret World, but I knew about this connection going in. For anyone who isn't aware of this, these references will be absolutely confusing and nonsensical. This drastically hinders the game, making it feel like an incomplete story. And it's not like The Secret World is a sequel, it's an entirely separate game that you would have to spend potentially hundreds of hours in to even reach the content related to the park. Alan Wake 2 does something similar, tying in the FBC from Control, but at the very least you're given some level of context for what the FBC is. The park doesn't do that. It throws in references like a Marvel film, and if you don't get it, you're just screwed. Don't worry though, I'm going to stay screwed with you, because between my obsession with Warhammer 40k and the surprisingly complex lore of the Sonic the Hedgehog comics, I'm not interested in circling the drain of yet another time sink. Instead, we're going to be circling the Octotron, which Lorraine decides to hop on with literally no explanation or story relevance. She just really can't get enough of cheap carnival rides, I guess. Anyway, you don't need to worry, this part is simple enough where I'm not going to spend several more paragraphs describing about how it absolutely fails at yet another— wait, never mind, I've got something. This ride introduces a second monster who shows up, smiles, and disappears. In the credits he's called the Boogeyman, but since the game never directly gives us a name, I'm just going to refer him by the 8-year-old Kadikarus reference that popped into my head the first time I saw him— Spindly Johnny. Unlike Chad, who actually had build-up, suspense, and even story relevance, Spindly Johnny here just shows up. Just like that. And this is literally moments after we get the lore note of Chad gouging the one guy's eye out, which means they were building up one monster just to immediately show us an entirely unrelated one. Why go through all the trouble of building up an interesting character if you're just going to shove them aside for a completely different one with absolutely no context? The game even continues building up Chad afterwards, even though we just got introduced to Spindly Johnny not even a minute before. It just comes off as confusing and completely destroys the tension. Anyway, after that completely pointless carnival ride, we move on and get another monologue, one that, because I was so bored at this point, actually gave me a jump scare.
Treachery hides in thoughts. Treachery that lashes like a whip and scars our insides. The first time I saw Callum, my thoughts betrayed me.
It's around this point that you may figure out why all the paths are so long with so little to see or do on them. It's because the game has to make room for Lorraine's monologues. She has a lot of these, and unfortunately they largely fall into one of two categories: complaining about how much her life sucks or complaining about how much she hates Callum. She almost never comments on what's happening now. You know, the spooky, haunted theme park that any sane human being would be questioning the reality of. She never even talks about how Callum is currently lost or is worried or angry at him directly. It's all just monologues of her past and literally nothing else, and that is a major problem. Rather than being shown Lorraine's story through abstract imagery, we're only ever told it. I wouldn't be making such a big deal out of this except for the fact that the game knows it should be showing and not telling because of what happens right here. This, while rather heavy-handed, works not only from a horror perspective, but a story and character perspective as well. For one, they managed to actually twist one of the attractions into something horrific, you know, like a haunted theme park should be doing. It takes the electrified ceiling of the bumper cars and contorts it into an electroshock therapy treatment. Two, this shows us, not tells us, something about Lorraine, which is again what the entire park should be doing. From this, we not only know that Lorraine is undergoing electroshock therapy, but we see her character's perspective on it. Electroshock therapy, from what I could find, is unconscious uncomfortable but not actually painful. However, Lorraine still sees this procedure as akin to torture, which is another insight we're shown and not told. This entire sequence lasts less than 30 seconds and has far more impact than any number of hours of monologuing could ever achieve. Can you imagine how much more boring it would have been to just hear Lorraine monologue about it with some token phrasing like, "It was like a bolt of lightning," or "It was 1,000 volts surging through my veins," or even, "This is another joke because this monologue literally happens immediately after."
It's a matter of public record that I am a failure as a mother. Once, when Callum was very small, I left him asleep in the car while I ran an errand. When I came back, the sheriff was standing next to the car. "I know what you're going through. My daughter, Helen, she just gets some help." Help was a bolt of lightning. Help was 1,000 volts surging through my veins. Help is agony.
They had one decent scare, one good moment, and instead of letting us linger on it and have the discomfort settle, they steal an edgy middle schooler's diary and read it like it's supposed to disturb us. And continuing the trend of telling and not showing, we get a random note that tells us the park is... Let me just double check this. A nexus for dark energies. To absolutely nobody's surprise, this game has the standard mechanic of leaving notes behind to tell you background details, but instead of background details, these notes, well, it'd be better if I just explain it. We find more notes like this through the whole game, describing the efforts of Mr. Winter to harness a bunch of dark energies using carnival rides for some generic evil reason. I'm talking about this now because it's not even really a spoiler. This entire storyline has nothing to do with Lorraine's search for Callum. We never come across any kind of occult sigils, creepy machinery, or dried up corpses sucked of all their joy. If these notes didn't exist, we'd never even know of this plot. And frankly, a twisted theme park owner sucking out the souls of children via cursed carnival rides sounds like a far more interesting story than Callum Wonderworld. Imagine you're playing Halo, but instead of playing as Master Chief, you're just an accountant on the Pillar of Autumn handling the Navy's finances while hearing about all the cool shit Master Chief is up to. That's what reading these notes feels like. We get to our next set piece, and I really am honest when I say that I have no massive rants to go on this time. Really, I promise. There's nothing for me to talk about here because nothing happens. You go up, Lorraine monologues again, you go down, and you get off. I guess you see spindly Johnny's at the controls, but that's really it. This entire set piece is just another excuse for her to monologue about how generically tragic her life is. We move on and get this canned scare. I didn't mention this before, but the bumper cars do a similar canned sequence. During these events, the game completely takes away all control from the player, forcing you to a dead stop. Canned sequences like this aren't scary. They're just annoying. Running from a monster in a horror game is scary because it's an actual threat that we have to think and respond to. We're given our own agency, and the punishment for failure is usually death and loss of progress. Here, we're rooted in place, so we have no agency, and thus, anything that happens to us is completely scripted and supposed to happen. There's no tension in that. We know the Ferris wheel isn't going to kill Lorraine because the game isn't over yet, but by God, I wish it had because we still have 3 more attractions to get through. Next up on the list of rides Lorraine is getting on for literally no reason is the roller coaster, which she has for some reason never gotten around to, despite it being one of only 7 attractions at this park she apparently goes to all the time. This game pretends it's moving the plot forward and has our first actual interaction with Spindly Johnny, but staying true to the park's brand, it's just more talking.
We need to talk about Callum.
The ride itself is marginally better and tries to do what the bumper carts did, but they're just visions of Lorraine being rushed to the delivery room. As someone who's never given birth myself, I'm certain going into labor is scary, but personally this segment just seems kind of basic. Fear does this idea far better by having the mother give some honestly disturbing screams and having a scary ghost lady walk at us. The park, by comparison, not even that's done right. Callum doesn't even get hit, he just sort of hovers over the cart. It would have been way more visceral and disturbing to see him get badly injured in this vision, but the game just kinda poochies him out of existence.
I have to go now. My planet needs me.
You may be arguing that the park doesn't want to get that disturbing, to which I counter with this. So the game is clearly willing to use disturbing visuals, it just chooses not to. That part comes during the sideshow segment. This is where we get that lazy stand scare from Chad, and then Lorraine finds a random bottle of pills, which she just...
These are mine.
So I guess this establishes that Lorraine is on some kind of medication, but it's just so out of nowhere and doesn't tie in thematically. The bumper cars used the electrical railing to tie in the electroshock therapy. The roller coaster at least tried to tie in its rough and intense nature to her pregnancy. This is just a bottle of pills at a carnival. They don't even do anything interesting. Sure, Lorraine sounds drunk and the world now looks like a poorly done deep-fried meme, but this doesn't show us her perspective on the medicine. The bumper cars showed us how afraid she is of electroshock therapy. What exactly is this deep-fried meme world supposed to tell us? Spindly Johnny makes a return, but now he's just kinda standing around. He doesn't even harm us if we get too close. He just... Why should we be afraid of this guy? This whole incredibly pointless section ends with the scene of her bleeding wrists, and don't worry, even though that scene is genuinely disturbing, this game makes sure to ruin it by forcing us into a monologue the moment she wakes up.
The park is a collage of contradictions all of its own. Millions of people die every year in car crashes. And the park has little cars designed specifically to simulate that action. In the sideshow alley, you can walk away with 15 cents worth of mass-produced Chinese teddy bears, while a grinning carny pockets your hard-earned $5. The tears of jilted lovers, the soiled condoms of illicit affairs.
This whole speech sounds like the lyrics to a 2000s era goth band, specifically the kind a middle schooler would use in a music video for Shadow the Hedgehog. No, I'm not speaking from experience. In fact, now's a good time to talk about Lorraine's character in general, because she's been having a lot of edgy thoughts lately, like this one just before the roller coaster.
A lot of people idolize their children. You hear them talking about their kids and just the way they talk, their fucking voices make me want to vomit. You give up 9 months of your life carrying them, you traumatize yourself giving birth to them, and then you spend the rest of your life as their slave. Wiping asses, mopping a piss, feeding them. Little life-sucking monsters who take and take and take until we all go insane. Any parent who pretends otherwise is just dishonest. That's called choice supportive bias. I am honest. It served the little fuck right if I just abandoned him.
I don't even have or want kids, and that line pissed me off. You may think this game is trying to create a hateable protagonist, and while her remark of all parents hate their kids but I'm the only one brave enough to admit it would definitely end up as the top post on r/am I the asshole, they also showed us this scene of her electroshock therapy and tell us about generic tragic things that happened in her life. But then they also give us a monologue where it's implied that she physically abuses Callum, though she thinks it's being done by some shadowy forces trying to take Callum away, which she won't let happen because she absolutely loves Callum. And this is directly after the monologue where she stated she should just abandon him. This, unfortunately, leads me to a conclusion that I really hope isn't true, because it's not handled well. Given that Lorraine is on some kind of antidepressants, and considering how we saw her on electroshock therapy earlier, the devs are probably trying to convey that Lorraine has severe manic depressive disorder. Viewing Lorraine through this lens, everything about how she was written makes sense. Unfortunately, the devs have failed to realize that a character has a disorder is not a character. You can't simply point to Lorraine and say, look, she has manic depressive disorder, and expect us to immediately feel sympathy. A character has to be established first. We have to know them in some kind of stable state, see the things they enjoy, and learn about their life. That's when a fall becomes tragic. And one fantastic example of this is Khan from King of the Hill. Bet you didn't think I'd be talking about Hank Propane Hill during this review, now did ya? For those who don't know, Khan is basically King of the Hill's version of Ned Flanders, except instead of being overly friendly, he's just an ass. So a kind of Wario version of Flanders. Ned Wanders. It's not until season 13 that it's explicitly stated that Khan has manic depressive disorder. It's an episode where he specifically goes off his medication and we see how his disorder affects his life. This garners sympathy not because of the sheer fact that he has this disorder, but because we see how it affects his life. This is why Lorraine fails as a sympathetic character. The closest thing she has to a fall is about her baby daddy, Don. You'd think that if this story is about how Lorraine is tortured by her condition, you'd expect her disorder to maybe create some tension between the two and their eventual breakup, right? Nope. He just fell off the Ferris wheel and died. What about her relationship to Callum then? You could maybe tie her disorder into her hatred for Callum and how she likely physically abuses him, but I feel like she'd still abuse him regardless. Her hatred for him is rooted in the burden he causes, her lack of freedom as a single mother, and how she associates him with Don's death. Additionally, through the wonderful world of monologues, we know that Lorraine's father was an abusive alcoholic, and it's later heavily implied that Lorraine is also alcoholic. To quote fabled philosopher Stephen Armstrong, "When our guard is down, I think we'll both agree be that violence breeds violence. On top of that, none of the many tragedies in her life were caused or even affected by her disorder. Not Dawn's death, not her alcoholic father kidnapping her at a young age, not her financial troubles. Pretty much everything that's happened to her has been out of her control. Thus, her disorder just ends up as another loose thread in this already confused narrative. For those not keeping track, we have the surface level story of Lorraine looking for Callum, then we have the background story of Lorraine's life being terrible due to reasons all entirely outside of her control, but we also have the implication that she just happens to have a manic depressive disorder that's barely affected the story at all. Then we have Spindly Johnny running around trying to harvest the souls of children. We have Chad the Chipmunk who's busy doing literally nothing. We also have the witch who Spindly Johnny tells us about on the roller coaster.
Tell me where my son is.
Which has him now? Has both of you.
And we have Hansel and Gretel, which I'll bet you've completely forgotten about. You know what? Screw it. We are moving on from this horribly written character. We are finally at the witch's house, which means it's time to talk about Hansel and Gretel and how they have even less to do with this story than Lorraine's manic depressive disorder. I'd have an easier time finding thematic coherence in Balan Wonderworld, and that game requires a novel to understand. Save me! Save me, Balan Wonderman! Save me from this terrible game! So the next person whose heart we have to save is Ice Glover. We can almost immediately see how the streets and buildings look burned and warped, tying into his trauma during his last call. What's fascinating is that many of the powers still revolve around firefighting despite his incredible fear of fire, showing that, just like the title of the chapter, he still wants to be a hero, which just goes to prove that it's not f***ing hard to make thematic references. The park has an abusive mother, a lost child, and a literal witch's house. How could they get Hansel and Gretel so wrong? So a couple things first. The writer takes a few liberties with the Hansel and Gretel tale. For one, the end of the swan ride shows the kids eating the witch afterwards, which I could never find any evidence of. And second, Lorraine says that
In the oldest version of this story, Mother and the witch were the same person.
But again, I could not find this to be true. I even looked up the oldest version of this story and it's simply not there. I personally feel like this is cheating because they're modifying a story they're also trying to allude to, but even if we give the game this leeway, the comparison fails because Lorraine also states,
I used to imagine that Callum and I were the kids in that story. Not mother and son, but brother and sister, hand in hand against the unkind world.
So Lorraine is supposed to be the evil mother, the witch, and Gretel. What's absolutely insane is that she fits none of these characters. For the mother, yes, Lorraine is indeed Callum's mom, but in the game she is actively searching for Callum, which is literally the opposite of what the mom in the story does. She's not Gretel because, for one, she's not lost in the park, she knows exactly where she is, and two, Gretel is the one who kills the witch and saves Hansel. And I hate to spoil the incredible twist ending, but Lorraine isn't about to murder herself and save Callum. On that note, the witch doesn't make sense either. The witch is the one who trapped Hansel in her house, but if anything, Lorraine is the one who feels trapped by Callum. And sure, the witch wanted to kill Hansel, but not out of spite. He was just food to her. Just because I'm eating a Burger King Whopper doesn't mean I hate the sewer rats they used to make the patty. In fact, Callum doesn't make sense as Hansel either. Hansel was forced to go into the woods by his evil mother, but here, Callum is the one who runs into the park of his own will. And this isn't an unreliable narrator scenario because this actual living, breathing bodyguard saw as much. Sure, he ends up in the witch's house, but in the story, Hansel was lured there because it looked nice on the outside but held something horrible inside. Here, the witch's house is just the name of a theme park attraction. There's no real parallel to the witch's house from the story. They just called this place the witch's house and called it a day. That's not literary illusion, that's just pretending to be illusion. And it's not the only time the game does this. We have this prior speech by Spindly Johnny. When Lorraine asks him where Callum is, he responds,
The poor child. He tried so hard to do what he was taught. He even left you a trail of breadcrumbs.
To which I offer the rebuttal of quit your bullshit. Callum has not left behind anything but a shoe. There's been no clues, no breadcrumbs, and speaking of, Hansel didn't leave the breadcrumbs so his mother could find him. He left them there to find his way out of the forest. But again, Callum doesn't want to leave the forest. He likes it here. And where the hell does the dad fit into all this? Certainly not with Dawn. Lorraine describes her relationship with him as a fairy tale romance, but in Hansel and Gretel, the only fairy tale these two would end up in is a show hosted by Fairy Springer. If Shrek 5 steals that joke, I'm suing. Plus, in the story, the dad doesn't fall off a Ferris wheel and die. He actually shows up at the end to rescue the kids and tell them their mother died off screen. Nothing about this comes even close to the story of Hansel and Gretel. Sure, the game pretends it has a central theme of Hansel and Gretel, but you can't just talk about a story over and over and claim to be an illusion if your story has nothing in common. I mean, just listen to this part.
After they let me out, They gave me Callum back and sent me home with a handful of breadcrumbs.
What the breadcrumbs? Again, that's not allegory, that's stupid. This narrative is stupid. Stop being stupid!
Or maybe I'm just being rhetorical.
No, you're not! God, it's just like you use words from Hansel and Gretel randomly to try to sound allegorical.
Well, now you're just acting transcendent.
But you know what? I'm going to try my best. I'm going to try to fit the narrative of Hansel and Gretel into the story of the park. Dear viewers, I bring you the story of Hansel and Gretel as told by the park. Next to a great forest, there lived a poor woodcutter with his wife. One evening, the woodcutter fell from a tree and died. But the mother, now alone, gave birth to a boy named Hansel and a girl named Gretel. But the mother was also Gretel because she gave birth to herself. One day, when trying to find Hansel's toy, Hansel ran into the woods because he loved them so very much. The wicked mother, instead of letting him get lost, chased after Hansel because she was also Gretel. Both Hansel and the Mother Gretel hybrid knew these woods very well, but she still wasted time doing things very much not related to finding Hansel at all, including finding a random bottle of pills and taking them for her depression. On the way, she saw a great chipmunk named Chad, who did absolutely nothing to contribute to the story. She also met a scary old man named Mr. Winter, who was very busy stealing the souls of children, but that's part of a different fairy tale that we're not telling right now. Finally, she found the witch's house, except there was no witch inside because the Mother Gretel homunculus was also the witch who lived there. Then, this unholy abomination known as Wit'Gret'mu'thr found Hansel and stabbed him through the chest. The end. I mean, if that isn't a one-for-one retelling of Hansel and Gretel, I don't know what is. But speaking of the witch's house, it's time we get there and wrap things up in a nice little bow. This game has really been building this place up. It was the first attraction we saw, Spindly Johnny himself told us to go there, and Lorraine talks about it in several of her monologues. So it better be good. This is your last shot, game. What do you got for me? Are they trying to be funny? Why would they be trying to be funny just before the climax of their horror game? And if they're trying to be funny, why are they playing this actually decent horror ambience? We get one final note basically confirming Spindly Johnny is Mr. Winter, but he's mattered so little to the plot that I really don't care. Speaking of Spindly Johnny doing nothing, he shows up to sing about ducks and lures us down the path that we already were going on anyway. This is the actual end of the game. We step inside to find Lorraine's apartment. We walk through it, look at some random story notes, get another monologue about how awful her life is.
Where there had been color and light, there were shadows and regrets. Where there had been warmth, there was a bone-deep coldness that never went away.
We're led down another hallway, we open this door, and we then immediately know exactly what we're in for. Yep, it's a PT situation. Except unlike PT, that made us feel uncertain and told an interesting story through vague visuals and implications, the Lorraine house loop tells us that her life is awful and that she hates Callum. Gee, what a novel concept. What's sad is that some parts of these are actually done well, but because everything we're presented with here is just more reveals about how horrible Lorraine's life is, which we've already had drilled into our heads via monologues for the past hour and a half, it's just repetitive. We get through this downward spiral and exit into some incredibly lazy looking machinery that's on fire for some reason, and we finally get to our emotional climax. It's Callum. We finally found him, and he's wearing a cartoony Cthulhu shirt. Yeah, because that's not distracting at all. And we get to the story's big twist. Lorraine kills Callum. Then we get a short cutscene of Lorraine at a police station using the same dialogue as the security guard at the beginning because I guess this game thinks it's clever. I'd say the failures of the game end here, but they somehow managed to screw up even the credits. The music choice for the credits is this soft, bittersweet piano that sounds more fitting for the relief at the end of a long journey. Not a game where I murdered my own son. What, are we supposed to be relieved that Callum is finally dead? Because that's what this music sounds like. We even get this shot of a ghostly Callum reunited with his teddy bear, walking away into the ghostly abyss like his spirit is finally moving on. I'm sorry, this isn't the good ending from Five Nights at Freddy's 3 where the children's ghosts are finally freed from the animatronics. Callum was just murdered by his own mother. Before I wrap things up, I do want to say this. Despite how I've been absolutely tearing into this game, playing up being frustrated and over the top angry at it, I don't hate the park. I don't think it deserves hate. It's awful, don't get me wrong, but it's an earnest kind of awful. The decisions they made, however poor they may have been, were all made in a genuine attempt to tell a story. Not to sell merchandise or aim for mass appeal or to shove marketable characters into children's faces. And because of that, because they wanted to make horror, real horror, there's one more thing this game just barely did right. When I talked about the sequence in Lorraine's house, and how some of that section was done well, I underplayed it. Even though that section's impact is severely blunted by it just repeating information we already know, the game here gave me a tiny sliver of a feeling that I haven't felt in a horror game in a very long time. The game made me uncomfortable. There are many kinds of horror, but the horror I value most is the kind that makes you feel a certain cerebral kind of uncomfortable. It's not gained from an uncomfortable pile of gore, or an uncomfortably dangerous situation, or an uncomfortably dominant monster who insists you call her mommy. It's the kind of uncomfortable that makes you want to say, no more. I don't want to see more of this. Something about what I'm experiencing now is sending my body into genuine distress. There's not much of it here, only a sliver. But when this section gets to its deepest levels and Lorraine's voice actress is screaming her heart out in this horrible, painful way, it gripped me. Only for a moment. Not enough for me to say this section is good, but the very existence of this sliver of potential showed me that this game was willing to do what no mascot horror ever will. Mascot horror, in order to survive, has to be marketable, it has to be safe, it has to be comfortable. The themes present in the park, while poorly handled, are at least presented with a level of realism. Lorraine isn't some cackling mad corpse in a bunny suit hunting down children harvesting soul energy to achieve immortality. Lorraine is a distressed, single mother having intrusive thoughts about her son. So despite what I've been saying, despite how poorly presented it was, and hell, despite even the title of this video, what I find most fascinating about the park is how it could have been something fantastic. It's just a shame we'll never get to see that potential. The studio, Funcom, never developed another horror game again. But they did publish one. Moons of Madness, a horror game set in space peppered with bits of Lovecraftian terror, which is why I reached out to the game's developers, Rock Pocket Games, to ask them about the development process. And I actually got a response. Holy crap, is this what being a real YouTuber feels like? According to the developers themselves, Funcom was pretty hands-on during development. So you know what? Despite the fact that any reasonable person would go out of their way to not buy a horror game developed by a studio that they wrote an entire YouTube hit piece about, I'm diving in. I know nothing about this game. I've never seen a second of gameplay. But I'm taking a blind leap. I want to believe. I'm not guaranteeing I'll make a whole full-length video out of it, but I'm curious. I want to know if Moons of Madness are all the best parts of the park and more to create an actual scary experience, or if its worst demons will return and drag the game down with it. Will the park haunt this game? I guess what I'm trying to say is,
In my heart and mind, I always return to Atlantic Island Park.